You saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. On the surface, this looked like a feel-good manufacturing win. Another award, another ribbon, another polished press release celebrating excellence, teamwork, and global standards. The kind of story that gets a brief nod, a congratulatory quote, and then disappears from the news cycle. But that is not what actually happened. And it is definitely not why Washington suddenly went quiet. What unfolded in Canada was never about a trophy. It was about power, it was about leverage. And more importantly, it was about the quiet collapse of an assumption that has shaped North American economic policy for nearly half a century. The assumption that manufacturing excellence naturally belongs south of the border, and that everyone else is supposed to participate politely, gratefully, and without ever threatening the center of gravity. That assumption just broke, and it didn't break in secret, it broke in plain sight. Here is the official version of the story as it was presented. Toyota's Canadian operations won another Global Quality Award. Not just any award, but the one that pushed them past every other automotive manufacturing facility on Earth. More quality awards than any plant in the United States. More than Japan. More than anywhere else. The most decorated automotive manufacturing plant in the world now sits in Cambridge, Ontario. If you stop there, it sounds like a simple success story. Skilled workers, smart management, a company doing things the right way. Congratulations all around. But stopping there misses the point entirely, because this did not happen in isolation. It happened inside one of the most politically sensitive, economically strategic, and deeply integrated industries in North America. Automobiles are not just cars. Autos are trade agreements. Autos are supply chains. Autos are labor standards, regional development strategies, and industrial policy rolled into a single system. And the moment Canada became the global benchmark for quality inside that system, something far bigger shifted. For decades, the arrangement was supposed to work in one direction. The United States would remain the unquestioned center of gravity. Canada would participate. It would host plants, supply parts, benefit from proximity, and integrate into the system, but never fundamentally outshine the core. Integration was designed to reinforce American dominance, not challenge it. That was the unspoken deal. What Toyota's Canadian plants just demonstrated is that integration does not automatically reward size, volume, or political power. It rewards execution, it rewards investment, and it rewards long-term commitment. Canada made those choices consistently while Washington spent years fighting culture wars over tariffs, posturing about strength, and blaming workers for failures that originated far above the factory floor. This is not a sudden development. Toyota's Canadian operations have been collecting these awards quietly for years. No drama, no headlines, no victory laps. That steady accumulation is precisely why this moment landed so hard. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a one-year spike driven by temporary conditions. It was the cumulative result of decades spent building systems that prioritize worker training, institutional memory, and continuous improvement. Same company, same trade rules, same continental supply chains. The difference was how the work was organized and how it was valued. And this is where the discomfort begins. Because when global automakers decide where to place their next generation of investment, they do not listen to political speeches. They do not watch press conferences. They look at performance data. They look at track records. They look at which plants deliver consistent quality year after year without drama, decline, or disruption. Canada just handed them a very clear answer. If you want world-class quality in North America, you already know where it is. Now put yourself in Washington for a moment. For years, voters were told that tariffs would bring manufacturing home. That pressure could substitute for planning. That punishment could replace investment. That loyalty could be demanded instead of earned. And then a Canadian plant operating under the exact same continental framework outperforms every American facility without issuing threats or making speeches, just results. That is why the response was silence. No celebration, no acknowledgement, no framing. Because acknowledging this forces a question that American policymakers have spent decades avoiding. If Canadian workers, using integrated North American supply chains, can produce the highest quality vehicles in the world, then the problem was never trade. The problem was priorities. And that is the part you were never supposed to think about when you saw the headline. Because once you ask that question, the entire political story around manufacturing begins to unravel. For years, American workers were told that their jobs disappeared because someone else cheated. Another country undercut wages. Another government subsidized unfairly. Another factory stole what rightfully belonged to them. That narrative is emotionally powerful, but it is economically shallow. What the Toyota story exposes is something far more uncomfortable. When workers are given stability, serious training, and a real voice in how production systems function, they deliver extraordinary results. When labor is treated purely as a cost to be minimized rather than an asset to be developed, quality eventually collapses, no matter how many flags you wrap around the factory gate. Canada's success was not the result of national magic. It was the result of choices, long-term investment instead of quarterly panic, cooperative labor relations instead of permanent brinkmanship, public policy that treated manufacturing as a national capability rather than a political prop. None of this is secret, none of it is radical. It is simply ignored in systems where power has drifted away from production and toward finance. And that brings us to why this story triggered anxiety in Washington at precisely this moment. Trade negotiations are tense, tariff threats are back, auto rules of origin are being renegotiated behind closed doors. Political leaders want leverage, and suddenly Canada holds a form of leverage that cannot be sanctioned away: reputation, performance, proof. When Canada shows up at the negotiating table now, it does not arrive as a junior partner asking for access. It arrives as the place where excellence already happens. That changes the balance of the conversation, because threatening disruption no longer just hurts Canada. It threatens the highest performing parts of the entire system, the very plants global manufacturers rely on to protect their brands. And this is where the deeper logic of the economic system becomes impossible to ignore. Capital is loyal to returns, not rhetoric. If Canadian facilities deliver fewer defects, fewer recalls, and higher customer satisfaction, capital will follow that performance. No matter what politicians say on television, you cannot tariff your way out of excellence. You cannot bully investment into places where the underlying systems no longer support it. This is why the media framing fails so badly. It treats this as a national pride story. Canada wins. America loses. Cue the scoreboard. But that framing misses the lesson entirely. Industrial outcomes are not determined by slogans. They are determined by institutions, by training systems, by workplace governance, by supply chain coordination, by long-term planning. And when those foundations erode, no amount of nationalist theater can compensate. For ordinary workers, this matters in ways that are not abstract at all. A plant that prioritizes quality also prioritizes skill. Skill brings higher wages, more stability, and safer working conditions. A system built around continuous improvement depends on experienced workers staying, not being churned through and discarded. That is how communities are built around manufacturing jobs that actually support middle-class lives instead of trapping people in permanent insecurity. And it is exactly that contrast that makes this moment so dangerous for the existing narrative. To understand why this moment cuts so deeply, you have to look at what happened on the other side of the border. Because while Canadian plants were quietly compounding excellence, many American manufacturing towns were living through a very different reality. Plants reopened with fanfare, political speeches, and promises of revival. Cameras rolled, ribbons were cut, and then, quietly, the same story repeated itself. Automation without retraining, outsourcing without accountability, shutdowns without long-term plans. Workers were told to be flexible, grateful, and patient, while executives were rewarded for cost-cutting rather than craftsmanship. When quality problems emerged, they were framed as individual failures: a bad worker, a lazy shift, a temporary disruption. Rarely were they treated as systemic outcomes of decisions made far above the factory floor. Training budgets were slashed, maintenance was deferred, experience walked out the door with retiring workers and was never replaced. And when the inevitable failures arrived, the blame was carefully redirected anywhere except where it belonged. The Toyota story cuts through that fog because it makes denial harder. It shows in real time that decline is not inevitable, it is chosen, and excellence is not accidental, it is built. Canada did not stumble into this position. It earned it by refusing to hollow out the foundations of production in pursuit of short-term gains. That is why this moment matters far beyond one company or one award. It forces a confrontation with the basic truth about modern capitalism. The system consistently rewards those who extract value quickly, even when that extraction undermines long-term capacity. And yet, occasionally an outlier proves that another path is possible. When that happens, it exposes how fragile the dominant story really is. Washington's discomfort is not about Canada winning, It is about the narrative no longer holding together. The narrative that says power naturally belongs to those who shout the loudest, threaten the hardest, and invest the least in the people who actually do the work. Once that story breaks, the implications spread fast. Because if quality, reliability, and long-term performance are the real drivers of industrial success, then a great many policy choices suddenly look indefensible. Decades of tax cuts for corporations that did not reinvest. Decades of weakened labor protections sold as flexibility. Decades of public money handed out with no conditions attached. All of it justified by the claim that there was no alternative in a globalized world. The Canadian auto sector demonstrates that there was always an alternative. It simply required political will and a different understanding of who actually creates value. This is where following the money becomes unavoidable. Automotive manufacturing in the United States did not decline because workers forgot how to build cars. It declined because the ownership structure of the industry changed. Financialization shifted priorities away from production and toward stock price, cost cutting, and executive compensation. Plants stopped being evaluated primarily on what they produced and started being judged on how cheaply they could produce it this quarter. Training became an expense to be minimized. Maintenance became optional. Experience became replaceable. Quality became something you fixed later, usually through a recall. These choices were not accidents. They were rational within a system that rewarded short-term extraction over long-term capacity. In Canada, the incentives lined up differently, not perfectly, not without conflict, but differently enough to matter. Governments treated automotive manufacturing as a strategic sector rather than a disposable one. Unions retained meaningful bargaining power. Training pipelines remained intact. Companies that wanted long-term access to the market were expected to demonstrate long-term commitment. Over time, this produced something increasingly rare in modern capitalism: stability. And stability is not boring. Stability is productive. When workers know they will still be there next year, they invest in their craft. When managers know their success depends on sustained performance rather than quarterly cost cuts, they invest in systems. When communities know a plan is not going to vanish overnight, they support the ecosystem around it: suppliers, apprenticeships, local infrastructure. That is how excellence compounds quietly, year after year. The media almost never talks about this because it does not fit the preferred storyline. Conflict sells better than structure. Personalities sell better than systems. It is easier to argue about tariffs than to explain why decades of underinvestment hollowed out industrial capacity. It is easier to point at a foreign competitor than to explain how domestic policy redistributed power upward and risk downward. But this moment makes avoidance harder. The evidence is sitting in plain view. The same company operates plants across borders. The same trade agreements apply. The same consumer markets exist. And yet the outcomes differ dramatically. That forces a comparison no one in power wants to make too loudly. For working people, the stakes of that comparison could not be higher. When policymakers ignore these lessons, the costs show up everywhere: in stagnant wages, in unpredictable schedules, in injuries caused by speed-ups and understaffing, in communities that never recover from a single plant closure. These are not abstract outcomes. They are lived realities, shaped by decisions that prioritized financial extraction over productive investment. And here is the quiet irony at the center of all of this. The very integration that was supposed to lock in American dominance has created a benchmark that now challenges it. North American auto manufacturing functions as a system. When one part of that system consistently outperforms the rest, it does not remain invisible. It becomes the reference point. It becomes the standard others are measured against. That is what Canada has become. Not because it out-threatened anyone, not because it broke the rules, but because it treated manufacturing as something worth doing well. That is an uncomfortable lesson for a political economy that spent years pretending excellence could be outsourced, automated, or coerced. And so the real question is no longer whether Canada deserves recognition. The real question is whether other governments are willing to learn the correct lesson from this moment, because the wrong lesson is already tempting. Protectionism without investment, pressure without planning, blame without reform. Those paths feel emotionally satisfying in the short term, but they do not build anything that lasts. What this moment demands is something far more difficult: an honest assessment of whose interests the economic system is actually designed to serve. When you strip away the mythology, the answer becomes uncomfortable. Many of the failures we accept as inevitable are profitable for someone. Insecurity is not a side effect. It is a feature, A workforce constantly worried about layoffs and closures is easier to discipline. Communities dependent on a single employer are easier to pressure. Governments afraid of capital flight are easier to manipulate. The Canadian auto story matters because it interrupts that dynamic, even if only in one sector. It shows what has to exist for a different outcome to be possible. Long-term labor relations that do not treat unions as enemies, public policy that recognizes skills as a national asset rather than a private cost, regulatory stability that allows companies to plan years ahead instead of reacting quarter by quarter. None of this is radical. It is simply incompatible with an economic model that prioritizes short-term returns above all else. And that incompatibility is exactly why the silence from Washington is so revealing. The silence from Washington is revealing because acknowledging Canada's success would require acknowledging something far more dangerous. It would require admitting that American decline was not preordained. It would require admitting that different choices could have produced different outcomes. And once that door opens, it becomes very difficult to close, because then the questions start multiplying. Why were those choices not made? Who argued against them? Who benefited from doing things differently? This is where power quietly enters the conversation. For decades, manufacturing policy across much of North America has been reactive rather than structural. A crisis hits, subsidies flow, photo ops happen, politicians promise revival, and then attention moves on. There is rarely a sustained commitment to rebuilding the underlying systems that actually produce excellence. Training programs are fragmented. Apprenticeships disappear. Knowledge leaves with retiring workers and is never replaced. And then, years later, everyone acts surprised when quality problems emerge. What Canada demonstrated is that continuity matters, experience compounds. Institutional memory is not something you can recreate overnight with incentives and slogans. When a plant wins award after award over decades, it is not because of one heroic manager or one lucky year. It is because the system is designed to learn, retain, and improve. That design choice is invisible until it produces results that are impossible to ignore. And here is the part that should make policymakers especially uneasy. This success did not require breaking with the global economy. It did not require isolation. It did not require rejecting competition. It happened inside an open, integrated, competitive market, which means the excuse that global competition makes high standards impossible simply does not hold up. It was never about feasibility. It was about priorities. For ordinary people watching this unfold, the real danger is that the wrong conclusions will be drawn, that leaders will respond by tightening trade rules while ignoring the deeper institutional failures at home, that they will talk about reshoring without rebuilding the social foundations that make reshoring meaningful. A factory without skilled, secure workers is just a building. Machines alone do not create quality. Systems do. The Canadian auto plants remind us that manufacturing is not just about technology. It is about trust. Trust that effort will be rewarded. Trust that improvement will be valued. Trust that the future is something you are allowed to plan for. Remove that trust and no amount of pressure can force excellence into existence. This is why this moment functions as a mirror, not just for Washington, but for any society that claims to care about productive work while quietly undermining the conditions that make it possible. The mirror is uncomfortable because it reflects choices, not fate. It shows what happens when a system is aligned around long-term value rather than short-term extraction. And that realization spreads quickly once people start paying attention. If quality, reliability, and continuity are the real drivers of success, then many long-standing political arguments collapse. The idea that workers are the problem becomes harder to defend. The idea that deregulation automatically produces efficiency looks increasingly hollow. The claim that there was no alternative to hollowing out production starts to sound less like realism and more like justification. This is where class power becomes impossible to ignore. Financial interests gain when production is treated as disposable. Executives gain when cost-cutting is rewarded more than craftsmanship. Political careers gain when symbolism replaces substance. But workers lose. Communities lose. Long-term national capacity erodes. The Toyota plants in Canada expose that trade-off in a way no speech ever could. They make visible what has been carefully obscured for decades, that excellence is not incompatible with competitiveness, that stability is not the enemy of innovation, that investing in people is not charity, it is strategy. For years, manufacturing debates were framed as if there were only two options: Either accept decline as inevitable or retreat into protectionism. Either compete by lowering standards or stop competing altogether. What the Canadian experience demonstrates is that this was always a false choice. There was a third path. It simply required refusing to sacrifice long-term capability for short-term gains. That refusal had consequences. It meant slower financial returns. It meant constraints on executive behavior. It meant sharing power with labor. It meant public oversight. None of these things are popular with those who benefit from the current system, and that is precisely why they are so often dismissed as unrealistic or outdated. But the results speak for themselves. When one part of an integrated system consistently outperforms the rest, it removes the ability to blame abstract forces. You cannot blame globalization when the same global rules apply. You cannot blame technology when the same machines are in use. You cannot blame workers when the same company employs them across borders with radically different outcomes. What remains are decisions about governance, investment, and respect for labor. This is why the story is not really about Toyota, and it is not really about Canada either. It is about the kind of capitalism that has been built, and the kind that keeps being presented as the only one possible. A capitalism that rewards extraction over production will always struggle to deliver quality. A capitalism that treats workers as interchangeable inputs will always undermine its own capacity and then blame those workers for the results. The Canadian plants demonstrate that a different configuration is not only possible, but competitive. In fact, it is more than competitive. It sets the standard others are now forced to chase. That should trigger a serious rethinking of industrial policy across the continent. But rethinking policy is hard when it threatens entrenched interests. It is far easier to change the channel, far easier to escalate a trade dispute, far easier to frame the issue as a national rivalry rather than a systemic failure. Those distractions buy time. They do not solve problems. For working families, the cost of that avoidance is enormous. When policymakers fail to learn from examples like this, insecurity becomes permanent. Jobs become temporary. Skills become obsolete faster than people can adapt. Entire regions are left oscillating between false hope and quiet decline. None of this is inevitable. It is the result of decisions about who is worth protecting and who is expected to absorb risk. This is why moments like this matter, even if they appear technical or distant. Automotive manufacturing may feel abstract if you do not work in the industry, but the logic on display applies everywhere. Healthcare, education, logistics, energy, any sector where quality, continuity, and human skill matter. When systems are designed around short-term profit, quality deteriorates. When systems are designed around long-term value, quality improves and spreads. And that brings us to the final discomfort. The silence from American political leaders is not just embarrassment, it is uncertainty, because acknowledging this success opens a door they do not control. A door that leads to questions about labor rights, public investment, and the role of the state in shaping markets. Questions that challenge decades of ideology. Questions that cannot be answered with slogans. And yet those questions are already being asked by workers, by communities, by anyone paying attention to the gap between promises and outcomes. The questions now being asked are not radical, they are rational. Why does one plant offer stability while another offers precarity? Why does one country invest in skills while another relies on churn? Why are quality outcomes so uneven when the inputs are supposedly the same? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they strip away the myths that have been used to explain decline for so long. When excellence appears inside an integrated system, excuses lose their power. You cannot blame globalization when the same global rules apply to everyone involved. You cannot blame technology when the same machines are running on both sides of the border. You cannot blame workers when the same company employs them across different countries with dramatically different results. What remains, once those excuses are removed, are choices. Choices about governance, choices about investment, choices about whose interests are protected and whose risks are ignored. This is why the Canadian auto story resonates far beyond manufacturing. It reveals a pattern that appears wherever long-term capacity collides with short-term extraction, in healthcare systems that reward throughput over outcomes, in education systems that prioritize testing over teaching, in logistics networks optimized for cost instead of resilience. The logic is always the same. Strip away stability, externalize risk, demand flexibility from those with the least power, then act surprised when quality deteriorates. The Canadian plants interrupt that logic. They demonstrate that continuity is not nostalgia, it is infrastructure. Trust is not sentimentality, it is productivity. Experience is not inefficiency, it is institutional memory. When systems are designed to retain knowledge instead of discarding it, improvement compounds quietly. When workers believe they will still be there tomorrow, they invest in today. When managers know they will be judged on long-term performance, they build systems instead of chasing quarterly numbers. This is what makes the moment so destabilizing for the dominant narrative, because it shows that decline was never unavoidable. It was rational within a system that rewarded the people making those decisions. Financial interests benefited from treating production as disposable. Executives benefited from cost cutting that boosted short-term returns. Political careers benefited from symbolism that replaced substance. Meanwhile, workers absorbed the instability, communities absorbed the collapse, and long-term national capacity quietly eroded. The Toyota plants in Canada exposed that trade-off with a clarity that ideology cannot obscure. They show what happens when production is treated as something worth protecting rather than something to be squeezed. They show that quality is not a luxury. It is the outcome of alignment between labor, management, policy, and investment. This is why the story cannot be contained as a feel-good headline. It refuses to stay small. It forces a reckoning with how economic systems are structured and who they are structured to serve. It challenges the idea that insecurity is the price of competitiveness. It challenges the claim that workers must accept instability for efficiency to exist. It challenges the belief that the only role of the state is to step aside and hope markets will sort things out. And that challenge is deeply threatening to entrenched interests. It is far easier to redirect attention toward national rivalry. Canada versus the United States. Us versus them. Winners and losers. That framing preserves the illusion that the problem lies elsewhere, that someone else took something that rightfully belonged to you, that the solution is tougher language, harsher rules, and louder threats. But the Canadian example undermines that framing entirely. It shows that excellence was built, not stolen, maintained, not imposed, earned, not demanded. For working families, the implications are profound. When policymakers refuse to learn from examples like this, insecurity becomes permanent. Jobs become temporary. Skills become obsolete faster than people can retrain. Entire regions cycle endlessly between false hope and quiet decline. None of that is the result of natural forces. It is the result of choices about whose stability matters and whose risk is acceptable. This is why moments like this matter even if they seem technical or distant. Automotive manufacturing may feel abstract if you do not work in the industry, but the logic on display applies everywhere human skill matters. When systems are organized around short-term profit, quality deteriorates. When systems are organized around long-term value, quality improves and spreads outward. The silence from American political leaders is not just embarrassment, it is uncertainty, because acknowledging this success opens a door they do not control. A door that leads to questions about labor rights, public investment, and the role of the state in shaping markets. Questions that challenge decades of ideology. Questions that cannot be answered with slogans or sound bites. And yet those questions are already being asked by workers who see the difference between stability and churn, by communities that understand what happens when a plant closes and never reopens, by anyone who has been told to accept less while being promised more. The Canadian auto plants did not prove that one country is morally superior to another. They proved something far more unsettling, that systems matter, that priorities matter, that when you align incentives around long-term value instead of short-term extraction, excellence follows, and when you refuse to make that alignment, the climb becomes predictable, no matter how loudly strength is proclaimed. So, the real question this moment leaves us with is not whether Canada deserves recognition, it is whether others are willing to look honestly at what that recognition reveals. Because once you see that excellence is built rather than inevitable, it becomes impossible to keep pretending that failure is unavoidable. Excellence exposes excuses, and that is why this story matters far more than the headline ever suggested.